I never thought a propane heater would almost get me arrested in my own backyard, but that's exactly what happened on a frigid February evening in Columbus, Ohio. My name is Henry Morrison, and I had been living in the Maple Grove subdivision for about 3 years when this nightmare unfolded. I'm a 32-year-old engineer who works from home most days, and I bought my modest 3-bedroom ranch house because it had a decent backyard where I could actually enjoy some peace after staring at computer screens all day. The neighborhood seemed quiet enough when I moved in, though I quickly learned that the Maple Grove Homeowners Association had a reputation for being unnecessarily strict about the most trivial matters. The association president was a woman named Deborah Patterson, but everyone called her Karen behind her back because, well, she embodied every stereotype you could imagine. She was 53 years old with that trademark short blonde bob haircut that seemed to be regulation issue for HOA presidents nationwide. Deborah drove a white Lexus SUV and had absolutely nothing better to do with her time than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. Her husband worked as some kind of executive who traveled constantly, and her kids had long since moved out, leaving her with an empty nest and way too much free energy to direct at her neighbors. The trouble started on a Wednesday evening in mid-February. Ohio winters can be brutal, and that particular week we were experiencing temperatures in the low 20s during the day and dropping into the single digits at night. I had recently purchased a propane patio heater, one of those tall standing ones that looks like a mushroom, so I could actually use my back deck during the colder months. I'm not the type to let winter keep me cooped up inside for months at a time, and I had invested in some quality outdoor furniture that I wanted to enjoy year-round. I had set up the heater on my deck around 5 in the afternoon, planning to grill some steaks and sit outside with a beer while watching the sunset. The heater was working beautifully, creating a warm radius of about 8 feet that made the cold evening actually pleasant. I was wearing a heavy fleece jacket and jeans, tending to my steaks on the grill, when I heard the unmistakable sound of my side gate opening. I turned around to see Deborah Patterson marching through my backyard like she owned the place. She was wearing a puffy white coat that made her look like the Michelin Man and had her phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. "Excuse me, what are you doing in my yard?" I called out, genuinely confused about why she thought it was acceptable to just walk onto my property without even knocking on the front door first. "Henry Morrison, I am conducting an inspection of potential HOA violations," she announced in that shrill, authoritative voice she used whenever she wanted to remind people she had power in the neighborhood. "I received a report that you have installed an unapproved heating device on your property." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. "You received a report? From who? And what do you mean unapproved? It's a patio heater." She pointed at my propane heater with a dramatic flourish that would have been comedic if she weren't so serious. "That device is not listed in the approved outdoor appliances section of the HOA covenant. You need to remove it immediately." I flipped my steaks and took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Deborah, it's a standard propane heater that you can buy at any home improvement store. There's nothing dangerous or unusual about it, and I never got any notice that patio heaters required approval. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse," she snapped, walking closer to my deck. She was now standing right at the edge of my property line, though she kept eyeing my heater like it was some kind of explosive device. "The covenant clearly states that any outdoor heating element must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before installation. You failed to submit the proper paperwork." I had read the HOA covenant when I bought the house, and while it was indeed a tedious document filled with ridiculous restrictions, I was fairly certain that nowhere did it specifically mention patio heaters. The language about outdoor appliances was vague and mostly seemed concerned with permanent installations like built-in grills or fire pits. "Show me where it says that," I challenged, setting down my grilling tongs. "I'll wait right here while you find the exact section." Deborah's face flushed red, which was quite visible even in the fading daylight. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I am the president of this HOA, and I am telling you that heater is a violation. You need to remove it now, or I will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far she was willing to take this absurd confrontation. "I will call the police and report you for creating a public safety hazard," she said, raising her phone. "That propane tank is a danger to the entire neighborhood." I actually laughed at that, which was probably a mistake because it only made her angrier. "Deborah, millions of people use propane heaters. They're completely safe when used properly. There's no public safety hazard here. You're being ridiculous." "I am not ridiculous," she practically shrieked. "I am trying to protect the property values and safety of everyone in Maple Grove. If you won't comply voluntarily, then I will have no choice but to involve the authorities." I should have just told her to leave my property at that point, but I was too annoyed to think clearly. "Go ahead and call the police. They'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you, which is that you're wasting everyone's time." That was all the encouragement she needed. Deborah immediately started dialing on her phone, and I watched in disbelief as she actually went through with her threat. She stepped back from my property line, standing in the small strip of common area grass that separated our yards, and I could hear her speaking to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, hello. I need to report a dangerous situation," she said in her most dramatic voice. "My neighbor has installed an unauthorized propane heating device that is creating a serious fire hazard. I'm concerned for the safety of everyone in the neighborhood." I shook my head and went back to my stakes, figuring the police would show up, see that everything was fine, and tell Deborah to go home. It seemed like a waste of tax dollars and police resources, but I wasn't worried about getting in trouble. I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong. What I didn't anticipate was how long it would take for an officer to respond. The Columbus Police Department was apparently busy with actual emergencies that evening, so Deborah and I ended up in a weird standoff for nearly 45 minutes. She refused to leave, standing there in the common area with her arms crossed, occasionally taking photos of my heater with her phone. I finished grilling my steaks, ate dinner at my outdoor table while basking in the warmth of my heater, and generally tried to ignore her presence. "You're making this so much worse for yourself," she called out at one point. "The fines are going to be substantial." "I'm not paying any fines for using a patio heater," I replied calmly. "This is harassment, Deborah. You need to find a hobby." "My hobby is maintaining the standards of this neighborhood," she shot back. "Something you clearly don't care about." I was about to respond when I finally heard a car pulling up in my driveway. A Columbus police cruiser appeared, and a single officer got out and walked around to my backyard. He was a tall guy, probably in his late 30s, with a no-nonsense expression that suggested he had already dealt with too much nonsense that day. "Evening, folks," he said, his eyes scanning the scene. "I'm Officer Brandon Walsh. I got a call about some kind of safety hazard." Deborah immediately rushed toward him, launching into her prepared speech. "Officer, thank you so much for coming. This man has installed a dangerous propane heating device without proper approval from the homeowners association. The tank could explode at any moment and threaten the entire neighborhood. Officer Walsh looked at my patio heater, then back at Deborah, then at me. "Sir, is that your heater?" "Yes, officer," I confirmed. "It's a standard propane patio heater. I bought it at Home Depot last week. It's designed for outdoor use and is completely safe." He walked over to my deck, examining the heater more closely. "Is it stable, properly assembled?" "Yes, sir. I followed all the manufacturer's instructions. The tank is secured correctly, and I've been using it without any issues." Officer Walsh nodded slowly. "These are pretty common. My brother-in-law has one. They're safe as long as you're not an idiot about it." He turned to Deborah. "Madam, I don't see any safety violation here. This is a commercially available product being used for its intended purpose." "But it wasn't approved by the HOA," Deborah protested, her voice rising again. "He violated the covenant by installing it without permission." "That's a civil matter between you and the homeowners association," Officer Walsh explained patiently. "It's not a criminal issue, and it's definitely not a police matter. If you have a dispute about HOA rules, you need to handle that through your normal channels." Deborah's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "Are you seriously telling me that you're not going to do anything about this?" "There's nothing to do, madam. No laws are being broken here." I felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over me. Finally, someone with actual authority was telling Deborah what I had been trying to explain all evening. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, she doubled down. "Fine," she spat. "If you won't help me, then I'll handle this myself. Henry Morrison, I am issuing you an immediate cease and desist order regarding that heater. If it's not removed by tomorrow morning, you will face a fine of $500 per day until you comply." "Actually, madam," Officer Walsh interjected, "I need to ask you something. How did you get into this backyard?" Deborah blinked, clearly not expecting that question. "I walked through the side gate. I'm the HOA president. I have the authority to inspect properties." "Do you have the homeowner's permission to be on this property?" Officer Walsh asked. "I don't need permission. I already told you I'm the HOA president." Officer Walsh turned to me. "Sir, did you give her permission to enter your backyard?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "She just opened my gate and walked in without asking. I've been wanting her to leave for the past hour." The officer's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Madam, being the HOA president doesn't give you the legal right to enter someone's private property without permission. That's trespassing." Deborah's mouth fell open. "What? That's absurd. I have a duty to enforce the covenant." "You can enforce your HOA rules through proper legal channels, but you can't just walk onto someone's property whenever you feel like it," Officer Walsh explained. "The homeowner is telling me that you're here without his permission and that he wants you to leave. If you refuse, I'll have to cite you for trespassing." I had not seen this twist coming, and I had to admit it was deeply satisfying. Deborah looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she tried to process what was happening. "This is outrageous," she finally managed. "I was doing my job." "Your job doesn't override property rights," Officer Walsh said flatly. "Sir, do you want to press charges for trespassing?" I thought about it for a moment. On one hand, I didn't want to escalate the situation further or create even more animosity with the HOA president. On the other hand, Deborah had been harassing me for months with various petty complaints, and maybe she needed to face some consequences for her behavior. "I want her off my property," I said carefully, "and I want it documented that she was trespassing. But I'm not going to press charges tonight if she leaves immediately and agrees not to enter my property without permission again." Officer Walsh nodded. "That's fair. Madam, you need to leave this property right now. And in the future, if you need to inspect something, You need to get the homeowner's written permission first or follow whatever legal process your HOA has established. You can't just walk onto private property. Do you understand? Deborah was trembling with rage and humiliation. This isn't over, she hissed at me. You have no idea what you've just started. That sounds like a threat, madam, Officer Walsh said sharply. I suggest you leave now before this situation gets worse. She finally turned and stalked away, her white coat making her visible as she stomped back to her house 3 doors down. Officer Walsh watched her go, then turned back to me with a slight shake of his head. HOA disputes, he muttered. We get these calls more often than you'd think. For what it's worth, your heater is fine. Just make sure you turn it off when you're not using it and keep it away from any flammable materials. Will do, officer. Thanks for being reasonable about this. Part of the job. Have a good evening and try to stay warm. He headed back to his cruiser, and I watched him drive away before finally letting out a long breath. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But I severely underestimated how vindictive Deborah Patterson could be when she felt humiliated. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal notice from the HOA taped to my front door. It was a violation notice, written in official-sounding legal language, informing me that I had 7 days to remove my unauthorized outdoor heating apparatus or face daily fines of $500. The notice also informed me that I was being summoned to appear at an emergency HOA board meeting the following Monday evening to address my multiple violations of community standards. I read through the document twice, trying to figure out what these multiple violations were, and discovered that Deborah had apparently been keeping a list. According to the notice, I was also in violation for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection, for allowing my grass to exceed the maximum allowable height of 3 inches during the previous summer, and for parking my work truck in my driveway overnight on 3 occasions. Every single one of these alleged violations was either completely made up or so trivial that I couldn't believe anyone had actually documented them. The trash can thing was ridiculous because everyone in the neighborhood left their cans out until they got home from work on collection day. The grass height claim was absurd because I mowed my lawn regularly, and my work truck was a normal Ford F-150 that I occasionally drove when I had to visit job sites. There was nothing in the covenant that prohibited work vehicles. I called my buddy Marcus, who lived 2 streets over and had dealt with his own HOA issues in the past. Marcus worked as a real estate attorney, and while HOA law wasn't his specialty, he knew enough to give me some guidance. "Dude, she's retaliating because the cop embarrassed her," Marcus said when I explained the situation. "This is textbook harassment. Do you have the original covenant documents?" "Yeah, I've got everything from when I closed on the house. Read through them carefully and document everything. Take photos of your heater, photos of other people's trash cans, photos of other trucks in driveways. Build a case showing that she's targeting you specifically while ignoring the same behavior from other residents. Should I get a lawyer? Maybe, but let's see how the board meeting goes first." Sometimes these things can be resolved without spending money on legal fees. Just don't let her bully you into paying those fines or removing your heater if you genuinely believe you're in compliance with the rules. I spent the next few days doing exactly what Marcus suggested. I read through the entire HOA covenant, which was a mind-numbing 73 pages of dense legal language. What I discovered was that most of Deborah's claims were either stretches of ambiguous language or outright fabrications. The section about outdoor appliances mentioned permanent installations and specifically called out things like swimming pools, hot tubs, and storage sheds. There was nothing about patio heaters or other portable equipment. The trash can rule did exist, but it specified that cans should be stored out of sight except on collection days, with no specific time limit mentioned. The grass height rule was real, but it applied to grass that was excessively overgrown, which was subjective and certainly didn't apply to my lawn. And there was absolutely nothing in the covenant about work vehicles, only a prohibition against commercial vehicles defined as trucks over a certain weight class or vehicles with commercial advertising. I took probably 100 photos documenting everything. Other neighbors with patio heaters, including Martha Stevenson, who lived right next to Deborah. Other trash cans that stayed out overnight. Other trucks parked in driveways. My own well-maintained lawn. Everything I could think of that might be relevant. The weekend before the board meeting, I got a visit from two of my neighbors, Frank and Rachel Hughes. They were a retired couple in their late 60s who had lived in Maple Grove since the neighborhood was first built 20 years ago. "Henry, we heard about what happened with Deborah," Frank said when I opened the door. "We wanted you to know that you're not alone in dealing with her nonsense." Rachel nodded emphatically. "She's been getting worse over the past year. The power has gone to her head. We've watched her target at least 6 different families with these ridiculous violations." "Why doesn't anyone vote her out?" I asked. "She has to be elected, right?" Frank sighed. "She runs unopposed every year because nobody wants the headache of dealing with HOA business. Most people just try to fly under her radar and hope she doesn't notice them. But you stood up to her, and now she's made you her target." "What happened to the other families she went after?" I asked. "Most of them either complied with her demands or moved away," Rachel said sadly. "The Johnsons fought her for about 6 months over a fence issue, and it got so nasty that they eventually just sold their house and left. She can make your life miserable if she wants to." This was not encouraging news, but I appreciated them taking the time to warn me. "I'm not removing my heater," I said firmly. "It's not a violation, and I'm not going to be bullied." "Good for you," Frank said. "If you need character witnesses or anything for the board meeting, let us know. There are quite a few people in the neighborhood who are sick of Deborah's behavior." Monday evening arrived faster than I wanted. The HOA board meeting was being held at the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly sat empty except for monthly meetings and the occasional birthday party rental. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a folder full of printed photos and documentation, and found that several people were already there. The board consisted of 5 members, Deborah as president, a guy named Richard Turner as vice president, a woman named Susan Chen as treasurer, and 2 at-large members named Patrick Wilson and Jennifer Marks. I knew Richard slightly because he lived on my street, and he seemed like a reasonable person. I had never really interacted with the others. Deborah sat at the head of a folding table, arranging papers with exaggerated importance. When she saw me walk in, her expression hardened into something between smugness and anger. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for joining us," she said in an icy tone. "Please take a seat. We'll get to your violations shortly." I sat down in one of the chairs arranged for residents, noticing that Frank and Rachel had also shown up. So had about 10 other neighbors, which was unusual because these meetings typically only attracted 3 or 4 people. Word had apparently spread about this confrontation. Deborah went through the standard boring agenda items first, discussing budget matters and upcoming landscaping projects for the common areas. I could tell she was drawing it out on purpose, making me wait. Finally, after 45 minutes of tedium, she turned her attention to me. "Now we come to the matter of Henry Morrison and his multiple violations of the community covenant," she announced. Mr. Morrison has been issued a notice regarding an unauthorized outdoor heating device, improper trash can storage, inadequate lawn maintenance, and prohibited vehicle parking. Mr. Morrison, would you like to address these allegations? I stood up, keeping my voice calm and professional. Yes, I would. I believe these allegations are either inaccurate or being selectively enforced against me. I've prepared documentation showing that I'm in full compliance with the covenant and that other residents are engaged in the exact same behavior without facing any consequences. I opened my folder and started walking the board through my evidence. I showed them photos of my propane heater next to the relevant covenant language, pointing out that nowhere did it prohibit portable outdoor heaters. I showed them photos of other heaters in the neighborhood, including the one at Martha Stevenson's house. That's different, Deborah interrupted. Martha received approval for her heater. When? I asked. Can you show me the approval documentation? Because the covenant doesn't require approval for portable equipment. Deborah's face flushed and she shuffled through some papers without finding what she was looking for. Richard, the vice president, leaned forward. Deborah, do we actually have any policy requiring approval for patio heaters? He asked. I have one myself and I never submitted any paperwork. The spirit of the covenant requires architectural consistency, Deborah said, which was clearly not an answer to the question. I continued with my presentation, showing photos of multiple trash cans left out overnight throughout the neighborhood, including at board members' houses. I showed photos of my lawn next to other lawns, demonstrating that mine was actually better maintained than average. And I showed photos of at least 7 different trucks parked in driveways, including a Ford Super Duty that was significantly larger than my F-150. If these are truly violations, then you need to enforce them equally across the entire neighborhood, I said. But I believe the evidence shows that these are normal behaviors that you've chosen to target me for because of our confrontation last week. Susan Chen, the treasurer, was nodding as she reviewed my photos. He makes a good point, she said quietly. I don't think we've ever fined anyone for trash cans before. We've never needed to, Deborah snapped. Most residents have the courtesy to follow the rules without being told. Patrick Wilson, one of the at-large members, raised his hand. Can I ask a question? Henry, Deborah mentioned you had a confrontation with police. What happened there? I explained the entire incident, including how Deborah had entered my property without permission and how the officer had informed her that she was trespassing. I kept my tone factual and non-emotional, but I could see several board members exchanging glances. Is that true, Deborah? Richard asked. Did the police tell you that you were trespassing? I was performing my duties as HOA president, Deborah said defensively. The officer was mistaken about my authority. I have the right to inspect properties for violations. Actually, you don't, Jennifer Marks said, speaking up for the first time. She was a lawyer who worked in real estate, and she had a look of concern on her face. Deborah, we've talked about this before. Being on the HOA board doesn't give us the right to enter private property without permission. We can observe violations from common areas or public spaces, but we can't trespass. I wasn't trespassing, Deborah insisted. I was doing my job. If the property owner tells you to leave and you refuse, that's trespassing, Jennifer said firmly. And if you're doing it as part of your HOA duties, you could be creating liability for the entire association. Did you enter his backyard without permission? Deborah's silence was answer enough. Richard rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. Okay, I think we need to table this discussion, he said. These alleged violations are either minor or questionable, and it sounds like there's a personal conflict here that needs to be resolved differently. Henry, I don't think the board is going to impose any fines at this time. Deborah, we need to have a separate conversation about inspection procedures. This is ridiculous, Deborah exploded, standing up from her chair. I am the president of this board, and I am telling you that Henry Morrison is in violation. We need to enforce our standards, or this entire neighborhood will fall apart. Deborah, sit down, Richard said, his voice taking on a harder edge. We're not going to fine anyone based on selective enforcement and questionable interpretations of the covenant. If you want to revise the rules to be more specific about things like patio heaters, we can put that to a vote at the next monthly meeting. But we're not going to retroactively punish Henry for something that isn't clearly prohibited. I watched as Deborah's authority crumbled in real time. She sat back down, her face contorted with barely contained rage. The other board members voted quickly to dismiss all the violations she had filed against me, with only Deborah voting in opposition. It was 4-1, and it was over. As people started filing out of the clubhouse, Frank and Rachel came over to shake my hand. "Well done," Frank said with a grin. "I think you might have just saved the whole neighborhood from her tyranny, but I wasn't celebrating yet." I could see Deborah gathering her things with jerky, aggressive movements, and the look she gave me as she walked past sent a chill down my spine. This woman was not going to let this go. I was proven right 3 days later, when I came home from work, to find that someone had filed a complaint with the Columbus Code Enforcement Office. I received an official notice stating that my property was being investigated for potential zoning violations related to commercial activity and unpermitted structures. The notice required me to contact the Code Enforcement Office within 10 days to schedule an inspection. I immediately called Marcus, who was furious when I explained what had happened. "She's abusing the system," he said. "This is harassment. Do you run any kind of business from your home?" "No, I work remotely for an engineering firm, but it's all computer work. I don't have clients coming to the house or anything like that. And you don't have any structures that would need permits, right? Just the deck that came with the house. Everything else is standard yard stuff." "This is going to get ugly," Marcus warned. "She's trying to use government agencies to wage her personal vendetta. You need to document everything and be prepared to file a harassment claim if this continues." The code enforcement inspection happened the following week. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Dave Roberts, walked around my property with a clipboard, occasionally taking notes. After about 30 minutes, he came to talk to me on my front porch. "Mr. Morrison, I don't see any violations here," he said, sounding apologetic. "Your deck is grandfathered in from when the house was built. You don't have any unpermitted structures, and there's no evidence of commercial activity. Can I ask if you know who filed this complaint?" "I have a pretty good idea," I said. "I'm having a dispute with my HOA president." Dave sighed heavily. "Yeah, we get that sometimes. People use code enforcement as a weapon in neighbor disputes. For what it's worth, I'm going to document that this complaint was unfounded, and if this person files any more complaints without merit, we can potentially charge them with making false reports." "I'd appreciate that. This is getting out of hand. Keep records of everything," Dave advised. "Dates, times, incidents. If you end up needing a restraining order or something, documentation is key." A restraining order seemed extreme, but at that point, I was starting to wonder if it might be necessary. Deborah's harassment was escalating rather than subsiding, and I couldn't keep spending all my time defending myself against false allegations. The situation reached a breaking point 2 weeks later during a particularly cold spell. Temperatures dropped below zero, and I was using my propane heater every evening just to make my house more comfortable because my furnace struggled to keep up with the extreme cold. I had the heater running on my enclosed back porch, which was technically part of my house, but had a lot of windows and wasn't insulated as well as the main structure. It was a Friday evening around 8 o'clock when I heard pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Deborah standing there with her phone in hand, her face flushed with cold and anger. "You are violating the emergency fire code," she announced without preamble. "I can see your propane heater through your windows and you're using it indoors. That's illegal." "It's on my porch and it's ventilated," I said, trying to remain calm despite my growing irritation. "And what are you doing looking through my windows? I was walking past your house and saw the flames. I have a duty to report safety violations. You live 3 houses down." "You weren't walking past. You were specifically coming to my house to harass me." "I'm calling the fire department," she said, already dialing. "They'll condemn your house as a fire hazard." I actually laughed at that, which made her even angrier. "Go ahead and call them." "I'm using the heater exactly as intended. You're wasting emergency services time again." This time the response was faster. A fire engine showed up within 20 minutes and 3 firefighters came to my door. I explained the situation, showed them my back porch setup, and they confirmed that everything was safe and being used properly. "The heater is designed for outdoor use, but your porch is ventilated enough that it's fine," the fire captain, whose name was Rodriguez, told me. "Just make sure you turn it off before you go to sleep and keep it away from curtains or other flammable materials." "I will. Thank you for checking." Captain Rodriguez lowered his voice. "Is that woman your HOA president? She was pretty insistent on the phone that we needed to come immediately." "Yeah, she's been harassing me for weeks over this heater." He shook his head. "We get false alarm calls sometimes, but this is pretty blatant. If she keeps calling emergency services for non-emergencies, she could face charges for misusing 911. You might want to document this pattern." After the fire department left, I sat down and started making a comprehensive timeline of everything that had happened. Every interaction with Deborah, every false complaint, every instance of harassment. The document ended up being 5 pages long, and it painted a clear picture of escalating harassment over a period of about 6 weeks. Marcus reviewed it and agreed that it was time to take legal action. "You need to send a cease and desist letter to her and to the HOA board," he said. "Make it clear that her behavior constitutes harassment and that you'll pursue legal remedies if it continues. I can draft something for you." The letter went out on a Monday via certified mail. It detailed all of Deborah's actions, referenced the trespassing incident confirmed by the police, noted the false code enforcement complaint and false emergency calls, and demanded that all harassment cease immediately. It warned that continued harassment would result in a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, abuse of process, and any other applicable claims. For a few days, things were quiet. I actually started to hope that maybe the legal letter had scared some sense into her. But that hope was short-lived. The following Saturday morning, I woke up to find that someone had filed a complaint with the city about my property being a dangerous eyesore. This time, the complaint alleged that my numerous code violations were creating a public nuisance and diminishing neighborhood property values. It was clearly another harassment tactic, and I was beyond furious. I called Marcus, who told me it was time to escalate. "We're filing for a restraining order," he said. And I think we need to send a letter to the HOA board informing them that if Deborah continues this harassment in her capacity as president, the entire association could be liable for her actions. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday at the Franklin County Courthouse. I took a day off work and showed up with Marcus and all my documentation. Deborah was there too, representing herself, and she looked confident that the judge would see things her way. The hearing lasted about an hour. I presented my evidence chronologically, walking the judge through every incident of harassment, every false complaint, every instance of Deborah abusing her position as HOA president to target me personally. Marcus supplemented my testimony with legal arguments about harassment, trespassing, and abuse of process. When it was Deborah's turn to respond, she launched into a long speech about her duties as HOA president and how I was a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. She claimed that all her actions were justified attempts to enforce the community covenant, and that I was the one harassing her by refusing to comply with legitimate requests. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Keller, listened patiently to both sides. When Deborah finally finished talking, Judge Keller flipped through the documentation I had provided. "Miss Patterson," she said, "I'm looking at this police report from the initial incident. The officer documented that you were on Mr. Morrison's property without permission and that he informed you that you were trespassing. Is that accurate?" "I was performing my duties," Deborah insisted. "I have the authority as HOA president to inspect properties." "That's not what I asked." "Were you on his property without permission?" Deborah hesitated. "I suppose technically yes, but I had a legitimate reason." "And you filed multiple complaints with various government agencies, all of which were investigated and found to be without merit. Those agencies were wrong. There are clear violations." Judge Keller set down the papers and fixed Deborah with a stern look. "Miss Patterson, I've been a judge for 18 years, and I've seen a lot of HOA disputes. What I'm seeing here is a clear pattern of harassment and abuse of your position. You've used your role as HOA president to target Mr. Morrison repeatedly, and you've filed false complaints with multiple government agencies. This is not acceptable behavior." "Your Honor, I object to that characterization," Deborah said, her voice rising. "I am simply trying to enforce the rules. If you were simply enforcing the rules, you would be treating all residents equally. Mr. Morrison has provided extensive evidence showing that you've targeted him specifically, while ignoring identical behavior from other residents. That's not enforcement, that's harassment." The judge granted my request for a temporary restraining order, which prohibited Deborah from contacting me directly, from entering my property, and from filing any further complaints against me with government agencies without legitimate cause. The order would be in effect for 1 year, and violations could result in contempt charges. Deborah looked stunned as the judge explained the terms of the order. I could see her trying to process the fact that she had lost, that her authority had been legally curtailed. As we left the courtroom, she shot me a look of pure hatred, but she didn't say anything. Marcus patted me on the shoulder. "That should put an end to it. If she violates the restraining order, she'll face serious consequences." I wanted to believe him, but I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. And unfortunately, I was right. 2 weeks after the restraining order was issued, I got a call from Richard Turner, the HOA vice president. He sounded stressed and apologetic. "Henry, I need to talk to you about something serious," he said. "Can we meet for coffee?" We met at a Starbucks near the neighborhood that afternoon. Richard looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said once we had our drinks. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. We voted to remove Deborah as president. That was unexpected. Really? What happened? She's been spiraling since the restraining order. She's been calling board members at all hours, ranting about you and demanding that we take action. She's threatened to sue the board for not supporting her. She's been sending aggressive emails to residents, trying to rally support against you. It's gotten completely out of hand. I'm sorry you're dealing with this, I said, and I meant it. I never wanted any of this to become such a huge thing. It's not your fault. Deborah has been a problem for a while, but most people were afraid to confront her. Your situation just brought everything to a head. Anyway, we voted 3-1 to remove her, with only Patrick abstaining because he wanted to avoid the drama. Jennifer is taking over as interim president until we can hold a proper election. How did Deborah react? Richard grimaced. Not well. She stormed out of the meeting screaming about lawsuits and conspiracies. She's convinced that you've somehow turned everyone against her. The woman has completely lost perspective. You think she'll challenge the removal, probably, but it won't matter. The bylaws are clear that the board can remove an officer with a majority vote if they're not fulfilling their duties or if they're creating liability for the association. We documented everything carefully. I thought that would finally be the end of the saga. Deborah was no longer in a position of power. I had a restraining order protecting me, and the HOA board had demonstrated that they wouldn't support her harassment. But I underestimated how far she was willing to go. 3 days after being removed as HOA president, Deborah filed a lawsuit against me personally. The complaint alleged defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a bunch of other claims that were clearly frivolous. She was representing herself, and the legal documents were rambling and filled with errors, but they still required a response. Marcus helped me draft an answer to the complaint, and we filed a motion to dismiss based on the frivolous nature of the claims. We also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and abuse of process, seeking damages for all the time and money I had been forced to spend defending myself against her harassment. The case dragged on for months. Deborah represented herself at every hearing, and she used each appearance as an opportunity to make long speeches about how I had destroyed her reputation and driven her from office. The judge, a different one this time, grew increasingly impatient with her behavior. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Jennifer Marks proved to be a much more reasonable HOA president. She sent out a newsletter clarifying the rules and emphasizing that the association would focus on maintaining common areas and addressing legitimate issues rather than micromanaging residents' lives. Several neighbors approached me to thank me for standing up to Deborah, saying they felt like they could finally breathe easy in their own homes. My propane heater continued to work perfectly, keeping me warm through the remainder of that brutal winter and into the next. It became a symbol of sorts, a reminder that sometimes you have to stand your ground against bullies even when it would be easier to just give in. The lawsuit finally went to trial about 14 months after the initial propane heater incident. By that point, I had spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, countless hours dealing with the stress of litigation, and endured more harassment than anyone should have to tolerate. But I was determined to see it through. The trial lasted 2 days. Deborah represented herself and put on a disorganized and increasingly unhinged case. She called several neighbors as witnesses, but most of them actually testified in my favor, talking about how her behavior as HOA president had been unreasonable and how I had always been a good neighbor. She tried to introduce evidence that was mostly just her own interpretations and opinions rather than actual facts. When it was my turn to present evidence, Marcus methodically walked the jury through the timeline of harassment. We had documentation of everything: the trespassing, the false complaints, the emergency calls, the targeting and selective enforcement. We had testimony from Officer Walsh about the initial incident, from the code enforcement inspector about the false complaint, and from fire department personnel about the unnecessary emergency call. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict in my favor. They dismissed all of Deborah's claims against me and awarded me damages on my counterclaim. The award wasn't huge, about $15,000 to cover my legal fees and compensate me for the emotional distress, but it was a complete vindication. But the story doesn't end there. During the trial, something else had come to light that neither Marcus nor I had known about. While examining HOA financial records as part of discovery, Marcus noticed some irregularities in the accounting. It appeared that Deborah had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including charging the association for inspection services that consisted of her driving around the neighborhood looking for violations. Marcus brought this to the attention of the current HOA board, and they hired a forensic accountant to review the books. What they discovered was shocking. Over the course of her 5-year tenure as HOA president, Deborah had embezzled approximately $47,000 from the association. The charges ranged from obvious theft, like writing herself unauthorized checks, to more subtle fraud, like inflating invoices from contractors and pocketing the difference. The HOA board filed a police report, and the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office opened a criminal investigation. I was interviewed as a witness, and I told them everything I knew about Deborah's behavior and the lengths she had gone to maintain her control over the association. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Deborah was arrested about 2 months after the civil trial concluded. She was charged with multiple counts of theft and 1 count of tampering with records. She tried to represent herself in criminal court too, but the judge quickly appointed a public defender after it became clear that she had no idea what she was doing. The prosecutor offered her a plea deal: plead guilty to 1 count of theft, pay full restitution to the HOA, and serve 2 years of probation. If she refused, they would take all the charges to trial, and she faced potential prison time. After initially refusing and insisting she had done nothing wrong, Deborah eventually accepted the plea deal on the advice of her public defender. I attended her sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because I wanted to see the conclusion of this long nightmare. Deborah stood before the judge, looking small and defeated in a way I had never seen before. She gave a brief statement claiming that she had made accounting errors, but hadn't intended to steal anything. The judge wasn't buying it. "Miss Patterson," the judge said, "you held a position of trust within your community, and you abused that trust repeatedly. You stole money from your neighbors. You harassed residents who questioned your authority. And when you were held accountable, you tried to use the legal system as a weapon. This behavior is unacceptable." He sentenced her to the agreed-upon terms: 2 years probation, full restitution, and 200 hours of community service. He also ordered her to have no contact with me or any other member of the HOA board. If she violated the terms of her probation, she would face jail time. As Deborah left the courtroom that day, escorted by her long-suffering husband who had remained mostly silent throughout this entire ordeal, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. Vindication. But also a kind of sadness that things had spiraled so far out of control over something as simple as a propane heater. Life in Maple Grove slowly returned to normal after that. The HOA held elections, and Jennifer Marks was officially chosen as president with overwhelming support. She immediately began implementing reforms to prevent another Deborah situation, including requiring board approval for any enforcement actions, establishing clear procedures for property inspections, and bringing in an independent accounting firm to manage the association's finances. I became friendly with several neighbors who had supported me throughout the ordeal. Frank and Rachel Hughes invited me to their weekly poker game. Martha Stevenson brought me cookies and thanked me for standing up to Deborah, confessing that she had been terrified of the woman for years. Even Richard Turner and I became friends, bonding over the shared trauma of dealing with HOA drama. My propane heater still sits on my back deck, a veteran of the great HOA war of 2026. I use it regularly during cold evenings, and sometimes neighbors will join me for beers and conversation while we bask in its warmth. It's become something of a neighborhood symbol, a reminder that standing up for what's right is worth the effort even when it's difficult. The whole experience taught me several important lessons. First, that positions of power, even small ones like HOA president, can corrupt people if they're not held accountable. Second, that documentation is absolutely critical when dealing with harassment or legal disputes. If I hadn't carefully recorded every incident and taken all those photos, I might not have been able to prove my case. Third, that there are more good people than bad ones, and sometimes standing up to a bully will inspire others to do the same. I also learned that sometimes the most trivial things can spiral into major conflicts when egos and authority get involved. What should have been a non-issue, a simple patio heater that any reasonable person would recognize as harmless, became a months-long ordeal because one person couldn't stand being questioned or contradicted. Deborah's need for control and her inability to accept that she might be wrong transformed a simple disagreement into a legal nightmare that eventually exposed her criminal behavior. Looking back now, almost a year after that initial confrontation in my backyard, I can see how everything unfolded with a kind of terrible inevitability. Once Deborah decided I was her enemy, she couldn't let it go. Each loss, each time someone told her she was wrong, only made her more determined to prove she had been right all along. It was classic escalation, fueled by ego and stubbornness. The financial impact on me was significant. Even though I won the civil case and received some compensation, I still ended up spending more on legal fees than I recovered. The emotional toll was harder to quantify but equally real. For months, I dreaded coming home, worried about what new complaint or false accusation I would have to deal with. I lost sleep, productivity at work suffered, and I found myself constantly anxious about what Deborah might do next. But there were silver linings too. I became much closer with my neighbors and developed real friendships that might not have formed otherwise. I learned a lot about HOA law and property rights, knowledge that has proven useful in other contexts. And I gained a reputation in the neighborhood as someone who stands up for principle, which has led to people seeking my advice when they face their own disputes. The Maple Grove HOA itself emerged stronger from the crisis. The reforms Jennifer implemented made the association more transparent and accountable. Residents became more engaged in HOA matters, attending meetings and paying attention to what the board was doing. The culture shifted from fear and compliance to participation and cooperation. As for Deborah, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband eventually sold their house and moved to a condo in another part of Columbus. I never saw her again after that sentencing hearing, and I'm fine with that. I don't wish her ill, but I also don't have any desire to interact with her. Some relationships are too broken to fix, and some people are too committed to their own narrative to ever admit they were wrong. The whole experience reinforced my belief that home ownership, despite its challenges, is worth it. I love my house in Maple Grove. I love my backyard, my deck, and yes, my propane heater. I love being able to sit outside on a cold winter evening, wrapped in a warm fleece, watching the stars and enjoying the peace of my own property. No HOA president, no matter how petty or vindictive, can take that away from me. I also came to appreciate the role that institutions like police, courts, and local government play in protecting individual rights. Officer Walsh could have taken Deborah's side that first evening, but instead, he understood property rights and made sure they were respected. The judges in both my restraining order hearing and the civil trial saw through Deborah's claims and ruled based on evidence and law rather than emotion. The prosecutor took the embezzlement seriously and held Deborah accountable for her crimes. The system worked, even though it took time and effort. One unexpected outcome of the whole ordeal was that I became something of a local expert on HOA disputes. People from other neighborhoods started reaching out to me for advice when they faced their own problems with overzealous board members. I connected several of them with Marcus, and we helped quite a few folks navigate conflicts and assert their rights. It felt good to turn my negative experience into something positive that could help others. The city of Columbus also made some changes based on what happened. After the multiple false complaints to code enforcement and emergency services, they implemented a new policy for handling reports that might be part of neighbor disputes. Now, when someone files a complaint, they have to provide their name and contact information. And if a pattern of false reports emerges, there can be consequences. It's a small change, but it might prevent someone else from being harassed the way I was. Marcus and I occasionally laugh about the whole situation now, though it wasn't funny at the time. He jokes that he should have charged me extra for combat pay given how crazy things got. I remind him that the case gave him some great war stories for cocktail parties. The truth is, I'm grateful he was willing to take on what became a much more complicated and time-consuming matter than either of us anticipated. The propane heater itself has become something of a legend in Maple Grove. New residents often hear the story when they move in, and several people have asked to take photos with it. I've been tempted to put a little plaque on it commemorating the Great Propane Heater War of 2026. But that might be taking things too far. Instead, I just enjoy using it and sharing its warmth with friends and neighbors. This whole experience changed how I think about conflict and confrontation. I used to be someone who would generally back down or compromise to avoid trouble. But standing up to Deborah, refusing to be bullied or intimidated, taught me that sometimes conflict is necessary, and that backing down to an unreasonable person only encourages more unreasonable behavior. You can't negotiate with someone who sees any disagreement as an attack on their authority. At the same time, I learned to pick my battles carefully. Not every disagreement needs to become a major confrontation. Most HOA issues can and should be resolved through conversation and compromise. But when someone crosses certain lines, when they start trespassing, filing false complaints, and abusing their position, that's when you need to stand firm and use whatever legal tools are available to protect yourself. The neighborhood itself changed in subtle ways after the whole drama concluded. People seemed more relaxed, more willing to take small risks like putting up decorations or making minor modifications to their properties without seeking pre-approval for every little thing. The HOA was still there, still enforcing reasonable rules, but the atmosphere of fear that Deborah had created dissipated. It became a neighborhood again rather than a fiefdom. I often think about what might have happened if I had just removed the propane heater that first evening when Deborah demanded it. I would have avoided months of stress and thousands of dollars in legal fees. But I also would have signaled that I was someone who could be pushed around, and I'm certain Deborah would have found other things to target me for. Bullies don't stop when you give in to them, they just escalate their demands. By standing my ground over something relatively minor, I actually prevented what could have been years of harassment over increasingly ridiculous issues. The story also illustrates how HOAs can go wrong when the wrong person gets into power, and nobody feels empowered to push back. Deborah had been president for 5 years, embezzling money and harassing residents, and nobody had seriously challenged her until I refused to back down. How many other people had she targeted? How many had simply given up and either complied with unreasonable demands or moved away? My situation became a catalyst for change, but it shouldn't have taken that long or gotten that bad before someone stood up to her. I've become an advocate for HOA reform since this happened. I've spoken at a few local government meetings about the need for better oversight of homeowners associations and clearer legal protections for residents. HOAs serve a legitimate purpose in maintaining property values and managing common areas, but they need checks and balances just like any other organization that has power over people's lives. Too often, they become little fiefdoms where petty tyrants can run wild until someone has the resources and determination to fight back. The financial restitution that Deborah had to pay went back into the HOA's accounts, and the board decided to use it to upgrade the playground equipment in the common area and repave the neighborhood streets. It was fitting that her theft ended up benefiting the community she had tried to control so ruthlessly. The new playground has a bench with a dedication plaque, thanking all the residents who stood up for accountability and transparency, though it doesn't mention Deborah by name. Some of us know what it really means. As I write this, sitting on my deck with my trusty propane heater keeping me warm on a chilly evening, I feel a sense of peace that I didn't have a year ago. I'm no longer looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next false complaint or harassment tactic. I'm just a guy enjoying his backyard, grateful for good neighbors, decent weather, and the simple pleasure of being able to use a perfectly legal patio heater without facing a quasi-legal inquisition. The whole ordeal reminded me why I value freedom and property rights so much. The idea that you can own a piece of land, build a home on it, and enjoy it as you see fit within reasonable bounds is fundamental to the American dream. When HOAs or individuals try to micromanage every aspect of how you live on your own property, they're undermining that freedom. Yes, there need to be some rules to prevent truly problematic behavior that affects neighbors, but there's a huge difference between preventing genuine nuisances and exercising control for its own sake. I've stayed in touch with Officer Walsh, the cop who responded to that initial call. We ran into each other at a coffee shop a few months after everything was resolved, and he remembered the incident immediately. He told me that he includes my case in training sessions now as an example of how HOA disputes can escalate and how important it is for officers to understand property rights and not just defer to whoever has an official sounding title. I was glad to hear that something positive came from it for his department too. The Franklin County prosecutor, who handled Deborah's criminal case, also reached out to thank me for my cooperation and to let me know that HOA-related fraud is more common than most people realize. She said they've opened investigations into several other associations, based on complaints from residents who were inspired by seeing Deborah held accountable. It's a strange legacy to have, but I suppose if my stubborn refusal to give up my propane heater led to other corrupt HOA officers being exposed, that's a good thing. Winter is giving way to spring now, and I don't need my heater as much anymore. But I know it'll be there next winter, ready to provide warmth and comfort, a constant reminder that sometimes the smallest things are worth fighting for. Not because the thing itself is so important, but because the principle behind it, the right to be left alone to enjoy your own property in peace, is fundamental. The Maple Grove subdivision is a genuinely nice place to live now. Property values have actually increased since Deborah left, contrary to her dire predictions. Turns out that people prefer to live in neighborhoods where they're not constantly worried about arbitrary enforcement actions from power-hungry HOA presidents. Who knew? I've thought about moving sometimes, starting fresh somewhere without the memories of this conflict, but I always decide against it. This is my home. I fought for the right to enjoy it on my own terms, and I'm not giving that up. Besides, I have friends here now, real connections with people who stood by me or who were inspired to stand up for themselves because of what happened. The whole experience taught me that ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to be bullied. I'm not a lawyer or an activist or anyone special. I'm just an engineer who wanted to use a patio heater in peace. But by refusing to back down, by documenting everything, by using the legal system appropriately, and by standing on principle even when it was costly and stressful, I was able to stop someone who was abusing their power and victimizing an entire community. If there's a moral to this story, it's that you should never underestimate the importance of standing up for your rights, even over seemingly small things. And you should never underestimate the danger of giving petty tyrants unchecked power over any aspect of your life. HOA, like all organizations, need accountability, transparency, and people willing to push back when authority is abused. My propane heater still sits on my deck, a veteran of battle, a survivor of bureaucratic warfare. It's just a simple appliance, a metal tube that burns propane to produce heat. But it represents something more now, at least to me. It represents the principle that your home is your castle, that you have rights that can't be taken away just because someone has a title and an attitude, and that sometimes the right hill to die on is the one in your own backyard. As evening falls and the temperature drops, I light the heater and feel its warmth spread across the deck. I crack open a cold beer and look out at my yard, at the neighborhood beyond, and I smile. I'm home, I'm free, and I have my propane heater. Sometimes that's enough.